Okay, guys, and action!
Do you wanna be a bad man? Yes, you do. Do you wanna taste sweet salvation underneath the summer moon? Do you need another hand now? Yes, you do. Go see Miss Joseph down on Columbus Avenue. Down in the city, there's a place that never sleeps. You can see it all up past 57th Street.
Oopsie daisy.
Music is hot and the drinking there's free. It'll turn you upside down before you count to three. You're looking for a helping hand. You need a friendly face. Feeling good, you can barely stand. You're falling all over the place. You're looking for a helping hand. You need a friendly face. Feeling good, you can barely stand. You're falling all over the place. You own it, they got it, they flown it, you bought it.
I'm an artist. You give me a fucking tuber, I'll get you something out of it.
Go see Miss Joseph down on Columbus Avenue. All right, Columbus Avenue.
There's no such thing as simple. Simple is hard.
I did not have relations with that woman.
July 1990, Goodfellas is poised to win the hearts of critics and moviegoers alike. But Martin Scorsese is already 3 months into a project that he'd been putting off for 7 years. In 1983, Universal Pictures purchased the film rights to Schindler's Ark, a novel about a German businessman who saved more than 1,000 Polish Jews from certain death. Riding a wave of success following the release of E.T., the Extraterrestrial, the studio had given the nod to Steven Spielberg, but the director felt that he wasn't mature enough for such a serious undertaking. Sidney Pollack and Roman Polanski also turned down the offer. The fourth candidate to be asked, however, accepted. Scorsese found the script enthralling, but a tight schedule and difficult preparations were delaying production. The window of opportunity finally opened during post-production of Goodfellas.
Hey, here he is.
Oh, you broke your cherry.
But by that time, the director had lost the desire to pursue the Schindler project, challenges that the director had faced upon the release of The Last Temptation of Christ were his primary deterrent. He didn't want to relive the boycotts, bodyguards, and threats that had been the fallout of his previous film. Meanwhile, Spielberg had by that time already directed 2 installments of Indiana Jones, Empire of the Sun, and Jurassic Park. The feeling of immaturity he once had was now gone, and he desperately wanted another shot at the director's chair for the film. In exchange, Steven offered Martin the opportunity to direct a remake of the thriller Cape Fear.
All I could think about was busting out and killing somebody.
Project that Steven had spent a decade pursuing. The film had already been greenlit by the studio and had a $35 million budget. Was this the greatest decision in cinematic history or a missed opportunity? Doesn't matter. The trade was made. Scorsese immediately took to rewriting the script. Screenwriter Wesley Strick had meticulously thought through every detail of the narrative with Spielberg, but the author had to write another 24 different versions of the story before Martin was satisfied. The final script was then shown to Robert De Niro.
I'd seen the original, I liked it. I liked the idea of the revenge and all that. And
I don't think you really understand what we're talking about here. 14 years.
The actor was attracted by the idea of stepping outside his typical roles to play psychopath Max Cady.
Come out, wherever you are.
He spent 7 months in the gym getting in shape for the role, with shirtless scenes being moved to the end of filming so that De Niro could be in peak physical condition. Robert's tattoos in the movie are real, but they were made from a vegetable-based ink that wore off after 3 months.
I don't know whether to look at him or read him.
The actor also voluntarily paid a dentist $5,000 to ruin his teeth. It ended up costing De Niro 5 times that amount to have them restored.
Funny. Counselor, do I look destitute to you?
Scorsese wanted to land Harrison Ford for the role of Sam Bowden, but neither he nor Robert De Niro were able to convince the actor to take the part. Upon learning of the role's vacancy, actor Nick Nolte jumped on the opportunity. He'd been dreaming of working with Scorsese again after their collaboration on New York Stories, so the actor hounded him for 3 weeks until Martin finally broke down and gave Nolte the leading role.
Good.
The casting of Juliette Lewis was De Niro's idea. Martin was looking for an unknown teenaged actress, among whom the likes of Reese Witherspoon and Drew Barrymore were touted as options. But Robert suggested that character be more mature. The first and only contender for the role was Juliette.
Okay, night now.
Okay. Good night.
She showed up for the casting call without her parents and was found to be a perfect fit for the role after reading just 1 line.
You're not the drama teacher, are you?
Maybe I'm the big bad wolf.
By the way, the actress had received full legal emancipation from her parents at the age of 14 in order to join the Screen Actors Guild and work independently. Legally speaking, she was an adult.
Parents don't want you to achieve adulthood. That's natural. They know the pitfalls of adulthood. All that freedom, they know it only too well.
The last to join the ensemble was Jessica Lange, and the leading actors from the original film, Gregory Peck,
King Solomon could not have adjudicated more wisely your honor.
Robert Mitchum,
Trouble is, poisoning a dog is just a fine. But if he's unemployed, you gotta have money, or we'll bust him for vagrancy.
and Martin Balsam.
This court does not condone feuds, vendettas, or vigilantism.
Scorsese had to find a replacement for cinematographer Michael Ballhaus, who had previously agreed to film Dracula for Francis Ford Coppola.
That's to my fault.
The primary candidate was Robert Richardson, who'd been working in tandem with Oliver Stone for 6 years. At the last minute, however, horror film veteran Freddie Francis agreed to get behind the camera.
He understood mood, he understood angles, uses of lenses, and we had a really good time working with him.
Not wanting to miss the opportunity to work with the master, Scorsese promised Richardson a spot on one of his upcoming projects. Filming began in November of 1990 and lasted 4 months.
What the hell are you doing?
As with all of his films, the director welcomed improvisation.
Are you offering me something hot?
No, it wasn't that good. I don't know, something about it. Didn't have, it was great, it was great.
In addition to the scripted dialogues, there is an entire scene that was born on set. According to the script, the scene at school is supposed to be a chase, but Lewis and De Niro decided to play it out as a seduction.
You thought about me last night, didn't you?
Yes, I did.
The very first take was included in the final cut.
So I shot 2 cameras, and I think basically the scene is, the second half of the scene, the tighter shots, were basically all one take. It just happened, it was very, like theater.
By the way, Scorsese was so impressed by the portrayal of Cady that he was seriously intimidated by De Niro's accent.
I'm gonna enjoy this all the more.
Robert took advantage of this and would leave threatening messages on Martin's answering machine a couple of times a week.
You can use all those fears to draw upon and learn.
There were plenty of trials as well. Laurie's torture scene was shot over 2 15-hour days, and the actress spent half of that time in handcuffs.
I don't know what I was thinking.
God only knows.
I could barely walk, and my arms were all cut up from thrashing around, and then De Niro complimented me. He said that Charles Grodin was because he couldn't take the handcuffs off when they did Midnight Run.
Thanks, because it's starting to cut into my wrist. Thank you.
I thought that was a supreme compliment.
The culminating scene of the fight between the Bowden family and Max Cady was shot in a specially designed 30-meter water tank. A real houseboat, as well as artificial rain and wind machines, were installed inside the system. Amazingly, Martin had thought out and drawn each frame before a location was even built. Minimal adaptation was needed for Freddie Francis to capture Martin's drawings on camera. Once post-production on the film had been completed, the director, for the first time in his career, listened to the opinions of test screening audiences. Viewers found several scenes to be confusing, so Scorsese again gathered the film crew for a few more shots. These details helped preserve the integrity of the narrative. For example, in the original version, Cady is never shown grabbing the rope, so audiences had no idea how he'd gotten back on the boat. These corrections must have helped, because Cape Fear became the 8th most lucrative film of 1991, raking in over $180 million at the box office. At the Academy Awards ceremony, both Robert De Niro and Juliette Lewis received Oscar nominations. Martin was surrounded by success, except in his own personal life. With the release of his new film came his 4th divorce, and although his relationship with Barbara DeFina remained amicable, that brought him little comfort. How can a director express his pain? Simple: shoot a costumed melodrama. While still on the set of Raging Bull, Martin's friend and film critic Jay Cox introduced him to The Age of Innocence. "When you do that romantic piece, this one is you." Scorsese read the novel 7 years later, but his desire to turn it into a movie didn't appear until after Cape Fear. The project got the attention of 20th Century Fox, so the director agreed to work on a screenplay adaptation, provided that he could write it with Jay. Fox had approved a $30 million budget for the film. Martin hired production designer Dante Ferretti, who had become famous for the scenery in Federico Fellini films, and also offered the leading roles to the actors he saw in the first days of preparation: Daniel Day-Lewis, Michelle Pfeiffer, and Winona Ryder. Lines were being rehearsed, scenes were being rewritten, and costumes were being sewn. Not the best time to cancel a deal, but nevertheless, that's exactly what the studio did. Scorsese was fortunate enough to be rescued by Columbia Pictures' Mark Canton, with whom the director had created Goodfellas. Mark provided the budget and took over negotiations with the owners of the old houses, where they'd been planning to shoot most of the scenes. The film's hallmark is its attention to detail. Among the numerous paintings shown in the film can be seen surprises like The Last of the Mohicans. Daniel Day-Lewis had just starred in a film of the same name.
Is that all you've been concerned about? It's long past.
No less impressive were the costume design, which received an Oscar, and, of course, the script.
Are you very much in love with her?
As much as a man can be.
Do you think there's a limit?
Scorsese once called The Age of Innocence his most violent film, with its opposing moral and physical pain.
You won't go back.
I won't go back.
But the Motion Picture Association must be okay with that kind of pain, because for the second time in his career, they gave the film a PG rating.
Why?
I don't know.
Editing turned out to be the greatest challenge in creating the film. The new genre presented some difficult obstacles. The Age of Innocence contains few L cuts, while jump cuts and dissolves abound.
Mrs. Manson Mingott sent out invitations summoning everyone to a formal dinner. The dinner, New York read on the invitation, was to meet the Countess Olenska.
Stylistically, the film is unlike any other, and it took Scorsese and Thelma Schoonmaker a year to get it right. However, the main reason for the delay was the death of Martin's father, Charles, to whom the movie is dedicated. The Age of Innocence flopped at the box office, but earned 5 Oscar nominations. Gabriella Pescucci brought home the trophy for Best Costume Design. Winona Ryder was nominated for Best Supporting Actress, while Daniel Day-Lewis wasn't in the running for an award, only because he was already being considered for his role in the drama In the Name of the Father. Only Mr. Day-Lewis could find himself in such a predicament.
I don't think you'll ever quite be like everybody else.
Per usual, the director's schedule was packed tight. Having barely finished editing his previous film, Martin began writing the screenplay for the novel Clockers. He quickly found some old acquaintances to fill the leading roles: John Turturro from The Color of Money and Harvey Keitel, who had featured in most of Scorsese's films. Universal put their faith in Martin once again, approving a budget of $25 million. At the same time, Nicholas Pileggi, co-writer of Goodfellas' screenplay, came to the director with the idea of writing a book, and subsequently a script about the life of Frank Rosenthal. Frank was a famous Las Vegas casino manager and sports betting genius whose ties to the Chicago mob were a mystery to no one except the police. Scorsese was fascinated with the idea, and Nicholas, like a true master of diplomacy, convinced Rosenthal to agree to the book because he would be played by Robert De Niro in the subsequent film. 1 month before shooting began on The Clockers, Martin lost interest in the film, instead becoming a producer and handing the director's reins over to friend and protege from New York, Spike Lee.
What the fuck happened?
Martin suddenly saw an opening in his schedule, and he decided to fill it with Casino. But Pileggi hadn't even begun a rough draft of the book yet. Scorsese, not wanting to wait, convinced the writer to work on the novel and the screenplay at the same time. Universal was the first to see the film's potential and bought the rights with a $50 million budget. It was an incredible leap of faith for a project with no script and no primary source. Their only obstacle was potential legal troubles. The sensitive topic of Las Vegas gambling institutions was enough to make the production's company's lawyers sweat. One wrong move, and the project could be thrown into lawsuit hell. Consultants convinced the director to change the names of the main characters. For example, Frank Rosenthal became Sam Rothstein. The surname was borrowed from a gangster from the 1930s named Arnold Rothstein, who was also known for gambling and sports betting.
Anywhere else in the country, I was a bookie, a gambler, always looking over my shoulder, hassled by cops day and night. But here, I'm Mr. Rothstein.
This didn't satisfy lawyers, so the inscription, based on a true story, was changed to based on real events, and just in case, any references to Chicago or the Chicago Mafia were cut from the script.
Even back home years ago, when we were first hanging out together, he'd know if the quarterback was on coke.
But the most significant change was the name of the casino itself. The story of the Stardust Casino was now that of the fictional Tangiers Casino.
I was given one of the biggest casinos in Las Vegas to run, the Tangiers.
However, there were a few clues scattered throughout the film for the observant viewer. The song Stardust can be heard on the film's soundtrack 3 times. The instrumental version at Ace and Ginger's wedding, the vocal version, and at the end of the closing credits. Another problem arose when crooks refused to consult the film's crew regarding how to swindle a casino.
And that's just what these hustlers look for. They cruise from casino to casino looking for weak dealers the way lions look for weak antelope.
But Martin's ex-wife, Barbara DeFina, found a way around this by suggesting they hire ex-convicts and retired FBI agents who had caught the best crooks in the U.S.
In Vegas, everybody's got to watch everybody else.
Martin began casting. Leading roles went to De Niro and Pesci, a classic combination for Scorsese. This time was no exception. The dialogue between these two characters is totally improvised.
What is it with you? All of a sudden you're trying to tell me what to do all the time.
I'm not trying to tell you what to do, but you're way out of line, Nick. What are you doing? Where's your head?
Where's my head? Where's your fucking balls?
Paradoxically, the movie about a casino involved paying off a lot of debts. Scorsese had saved the role of Ginger for Sharon Stone, who had left an impression on him 15 years prior. the actress had almost landed the role of Vicky LaMotta in Raging Bull.
You got the wrong girl.
The director's instincts turned out to be correct because Stone received the only Oscar nomination of her career and also won a Golden Globe. After Sharon, Martin called Robert Richardson, whom he'd promised to work with back in 1991. Together, they created the visual concept for the film, taking examples from the best films noir of John Alton, such as T-Men, Raw Deal, and Slightly Scarlet. Another allusion to the noir was the title sequence by Saul Bass, the most famous graphic designer in cinema history, who'd worked on films by Hitchcock, Kubrick, and now, for the fourth time, Martin Scorsese. Unfortunately, the artist passed away 3 months after the premiere. On September the 14th, 1994, Martin said action for the first time in Las Vegas, where he would spend the following 4 months.
Guys like me, Las Vegas washes away your sins. It's like a morality car wash. It does for us what Lourdes does for humpbacks and cripples.
Shooting was done inside a real casino. Actual guests can be seen in the background of wide shots, and real employees of the establishment played the croupiers.
What the hell did you learn how to do?
The Riviera management allowed filming from 10 p.m. to 4 a.m. so as not to disturb the mainstream of visitors during peak hours.
But we were not important. I mean, it was important there to everybody was the gambling. The first day of shooting, I see that they have an electric sign outside that says, "Come and see the shooting of Casino with Robert De Niro, Sharon Stone, Don Rickles."
The bosses also refused to allow any cameras into the accounting wing, so a separate set had to be built for that long sequence. The only artificial setting in the film.
The Holy of Holies, the count room. Now, this place was off limits. Even I couldn't get inside.
A large portion of the budget went towards wardrobe, the cost of which exceeded $1 million. De Niro had 70 wardrobe changes in the film, Stone 40. After filming had wrapped, the main characters were allowed to keep what they wanted.
Try it on. It's yours.
Robert personally selected each element of his appearance based on his experience of speaking with the real person behind his character. His serious approach started with his glasses and watches down to the way he spoke, smiled, and held a cigarette. By the way, cigarettes are a nightmare for an editing director. They can change length from frame to frame, or worse, switch hands. Robert kept Thelma's shoemaker in mind while shooting. Sam doesn't light up a cigarette for half the film to make it easier on editing, and De Niro made sure to note the cigarette's distance from the filter and verified it for every take and scene in the movie. Joe Pesci's ability to transform into his character backfired. Las Vegas bigwigs mistook the actor for the real Tony the Ant Spilotro.
You beat Nicky with fists, he comes back with a bat. You beat him with a knife, he comes back with a gun.
He wasn't allowed into certain establishments on a couple of occasions, but when Joe nevertheless entered the gambling hall, some people crossed themselves and others nearly fainted.
I'm a little confused.
You're a little confused? Maybe if I stick your fucking face through this window over here, like, you'll get unconfused. Give me the fucking money.
Pesci frightened people, but it worked in his favor. The actor broke another rib on set, just as he'd done in Raging Bull. Scorsese was elated to be working with such a skilled cast, but even Robert and Joe's talent couldn't build the relationship between the main characters, which turned out to be the film's most challenging aspect.
What am I doing out here? I'm trying to make a living, that's all.
I'm just telling you. Don't say I didn't warn you.
All right.
But Sharon simply shined. The director's favorite scene is when Ginger throws the chips in the air. But this was the more light-hearted and easy-going side of her character. Stone showed her true talent later.
I fucking hate you! Can't take it anymore!
Her method acting and intense dedication to the role took its emotional toll on the actress. While shooting the phone booth scene, Martin would hold Sharon's hand in between takes to help calm the actress, as she seemed to be teetering on the verge of hysteria.
Marty sat on the dirt by my feet outside the phone booth so that I could go to Crazyville, but so that I could see him and touch him.
Hi, it's me.
This is who you wanted to talk to, right?
Filming wrapped in January, and Martin immediately began the editing process. Casino is the first film in Thelma Shoemaker's career to be edited on a computer. Experience suggested that an abundance of violent scenes would lead to a battle with the American Film Association, so the director got clever. He added a scene with someone's head in a vice for the sole purpose of getting the censors to demand its removal. This made the rest of the violence in the film suddenly seem less brutal compared to scenes of outright torture. Surprisingly, they let the scene remain, but demanded that a couple of shots be cut from the bloodiest takes, after which Casino received its coveted R rating. The book and the film came out at the same time and supported each other's financial success. The movie grossed more than $115 million at the box office, but critics ignored it. Casino was considered a less impressive version of Goodfellas, and use of the same two lead actors confused audiences. Moviegoers debated whether it was a sequel or a standalone movie.
In other words, I'm fucked.
In so many words, yes.
The film also disappointed when it came to awards. Only Sharon Stone was nominated for an Oscar. Scorsese himself described the film as a 3-hour story full of action and events, but absolutely devoid of a plot.
Thank you. Thanks for that compliment.
So he didn't blame any of his colleagues for their lackluster reviews. He continued to work. A 4-hour documentary, a personal journey with Martin Scorsese through American movies, is perhaps the best exploration of films from the 40s and 50s of the 20th century.
I mean, over the years, I've discovered many an obscured film, and sometimes they were more inspirational than the prestigious films that were receiving all the attention at the time.
The narrative even seems like a spontaneous interview, but it brings to life the legends of his incredible cinematic knowledge.
It may have gone unnoticed at first, but a strange darkness crept into American films, a feeling of insecurity, disorientation, and foreboding, as though the ground could suddenly give way under your feet.
Martin was planning to make another film based on a book. A copy of Shusaka Endo's novel Silence fell into his hands while on the set of The Last Temptation of Christ. Of course, after the challenges he faced with this religious film, shooting another raised doubts among studios. Plus, there was a Japanese version made in 1971.
お前らの中にご近世のキリシタンを密かに報ずる者ありとの訴人があった。誰と誰がさような不届きをしておるのか。 The screenplay he and Jay Cox had written didn't help either. The same journalist who had introduced Martin to Cassavetes and given him the Age of Innocence. Negotiations with Italian studio Setchigori Pictures, who owned the rights to the book, led to an agreement, but the project fell into development hell until either Scorsese or the studio could find funding. Toward the end of 1996, Harrison Ford's wife, Melissa Mattison, approached Martin and asked him to read her screenplay.
And they said, "Who's that?" I said, "Marty Scorsese." And they said, their mouths fell open. I said, "Are you out of your mind?"
Kundun was a biography based on an interview with the 14th Dalai Lama and covers 30 years of Tibetan history. Not a single producer believed that the director would take on this film. His experiences with The Last Temptation of Christ and his own rejection of Schindler's List led to some uncertainty.
I'm not saying he wants to do it, but I know he's going to get it.
But nonetheless, he agreed. The loss of his mother, to whom the film is dedicated, was the director's motivation this time. Catherine had succumbed to Alzheimer's on January the 6th, 1997. This was very painful for Martin. The love and reverence for his parents could be seen throughout his career.
You did not want to say goodbye. never choose our way to die. I did not find a word to say. Some words to heal and a place to pray.
Tell you what I don't like. I don't like when he puts me in a picture and then he takes me out.
Well,
That's not fair. I worked so hard.
The Dalai Lama represents unconditional love, and to me, my mother was the closest person with that kind of love.
Is he still taking this? I'll murder you. You won't get out of this house alive.
Universal Pictures was the first to take an interest in the film, but no sooner had they signed the contract than their troubles started. The Chinese government opposed the film because it discussed the annexation of Tibet, and the production company got cold feet. Surprisingly, the project was picked up by Disney subsidiary Touchstone Pictures, who provided a $30 million budget. This earned the company a 2-year ban in China. Not a single Disney production was broadcast on the territory of the PRC. Not wanting to lose the market, the studio officially apologized, signed a dozen unprofitable film distribution contracts, and built Disneyland Shanghai at its own expense, the profits of which the Chinese government owns a percentage. But in 1997, optimistic producers were hoping for a positive outcome to this story. It was, of course, a little scary that the production only had 4 professional actors in its cast, and those only played cameos.
Tibet has been poisoned by religion, and your people are poisoned and inferior.
A young Dalai Lama was played by his distant relatives, and in order for the novice actors to seem organic, Martin brought in Roger Deakins. The director wasn't so much attracted to the cinematographer's outstanding credentials as he was his history of working with documentary films, where one's ability to work with people with no acting experience is essential for success. The military occupation of Tibet meant that shooting there would be impossible. So outdoor shots were filmed in Morocco, where the director had already filmed The Last Temptation of Christ.
We were intending to shoot in India, but, we just never got the permit. And so we're back in the Atlas Mountains, where I shot most of The Last Temptation of Christ a decade ago. Actually, it's almost the same locations, too.
While interior shots of the temples were filmed in a Buddhist monastery near Woodstock, also somewhere he had worked before. For scenes involving children, the crew had to build a clown house in order to get the children to look in the right direction when needed.
I'd sit there and I'd see that clown looking at me. We're just waiting and waiting and waiting until he was giving us something,
Kundun was a rare example of one of Scorsese's movies receiving a PG rating, but that did nothing to help its success at the box office. The director was convinced that Touchstone Pictures' fear of China led to them sabotaging the film's ad campaign.
We do not know how it will end, and it is very sad.
Without proper promotion, they had doomed Kundun to be a box office failure. The film brought in a meager $5.5 million, just 1/6 of its budget, and yet critics considered this film to be the most beautiful of Scorsese's career. price for bringing to life such beautiful yet horrifying events? Lifelong travel bans to China for Martin, Roger Deakins, Melissa Matheson, Harrison Ford, and 50 other crew members. But Scorsese wasn't planning a trip to Asia anyway. He was on his way to Italy.
The more films I made, the more I realized what an indelible mark Italian cinema had left on me.
Following his documentary on American cinema, he directed a 4-hour essay on Italian classics.
It's not as if Rossellini, Visconti, and myself sat down in the Via Veneto one day and said, hey, let's create neorealism. I mean, it basically started with filmmakers just trying to get their movies made.
These two films should be considered textbooks for every movie lover.
I like to think of neorealism as the seed from which a beautiful, solid tree has grown. And the branches on that tree represent virtually all the major Italian filmmakers of the post-war era.
Now back to the main storyline. He stumbles across an excellent book, receives the studio's approval for the screenplay, and gets to work. Bringing Out the Dead was a semi-biographical novel by New York paramedic Joe Connolly, for which Touchstone, as if to apologize for Kundun, allocated $50 million. Martin was able to persuade the creator of Taxi Driver, Raging Bull, and The Last Temptation of Christ to take on the screenplay. Paul Schrader hadn't written for Scorsese since their religious drama failure years earlier, but what better reason to get back together than for a story of New York by night, which Schrader was capable of describing like no one else.
It was the neighborhood I grew up in, and where I'd worked most as a paramedic, and it held more ghosts per square foot than any other.
A month later, the script was written. It read something like an eerie cross between the thriller After Hours and Taxi Driver.
All the animals come out at night.
The street's not like the ER. There's no walls, no controls. To make up for that, they try to teach me how to act without thinking.
While reading the book, Martin had already determined who would play the lead roles in the film. For the protagonist, the crazy eyes of Francis Ford Coppola's nephew were the first thing to come to the director's mind. Nicolas Cage had been introduced to Scorsese a couple of years before by his uncle. The director called up Brian De Palma, who had just worked with Cage on the film Snake Eyes. Brian highly recommended him.
It's a surprise.
Scorsese then offered Cage the leading role, who didn't hesitate to accept.
Our mission, to save lives.
Our mission is coffee, Tom.
Scorsese and Cage prepared for filming by spending every night in an ambulance for 3 weeks straight.
All bodies leave their mark. You cannot be near the newly dead without feeling it.
This was a sad experience for the director, or rather, a sad reminder. He had frequently found himself in the back of ambulances over the previous 10 years, supporting his parents during their difficult health problems.
Help your family, they need you more. Help yourself.
Martin hadn't settled on an actress for the female lead, and so Nicholas recommended his wife, Patricia Arquette.
I'm sorry, it's just... It's important to me, I mean.
Her very first audition earned her a spot in the cast, which included Ving Rhames.
You ever notice people who see shit are always crazy? Scientific fact.
And John Goodman.
Oh, no!
What?
I just remembered I'm so stupid. I had beef lo mein last night. I can't eat the same thing 2 nights in a row.
Filming took place from September of '97 to January of '98. Martin went on to describe it as the worst experience of his career. Instead of an inspiration, nightly rides through the windy winter streets left everyone with a bad mood and a head cold.
Homicides, suicides, overdoses, accusing me of being there, witnessing a humiliation which they could never forgive.
This depressing tone can be seen in the film. The neon lights and gloom of New York City at night were captured by Robert Richardson. And accompanied by the music of Elmer Bernstein, who had previously worked on The Age of Innocence.
Hold it on! Oh, I love this city!
Frank's attempt to save Rose is the essence of the film. The actors performed all of their movements in reverse so that the snow would ascend into the sky when edited.
Stomach again. No way! No pulse. Let me try.
The director's life somewhat resembled what he was filming.
but producer Helen Morris was there to dispel the darkness. For the first time in 10 years, love had re-emerged in Scorsese's life. While the movie was still in post-production, he proposed to Helen. The wedding was held in the summer of 1999, and in October of the same year, they had a daughter, Francesca, an event that could even be overshadowed by the complete failure of Bringing Out the Dead. The film grossed about $17 million, making the list of the most unsuccessful films of that year. The film has gone unremembered by critics and unappreciated by colleagues. 0 nominations and no festival premieres.
That is the last time you do this to me, Markin.
The millennium was near. The 90s had brought a lot of pain, but also made dreams come true. On the eve of the new year, Martin was heavily involved in caring for his child, never suspecting that he had not yet reached the peak of his career.
I have a desire to tell stories, and I'm never quite satisfied.
Oh yeah, keep trying again.
Period has begun strikes against Al-Qaeda terrorist training camps.
Everybody's trying to be heroes when all they have to say to be okay is I don't know. We are one people, and our time for change. Keep trying again.
Martin spent the beginning of the millennium trying to find funding for a project that he had been hatching for more than 20 years. He'd purchased the film adaptation rights to the novel Gangs of New York back in 1979, but no studio was eager to invest in such an ambitious project, given the director's frequent commercial failures. But in the year 2000, Harvey Weinstein decided to make Scorsese's dream come true, and Miramax Studios approved the film with a budget of $84 million. Martin now had the chance to express his boldest ideas. Production designer Dante Ferretti, who had worked with the director on The Age of Innocence, recreated 5 blocks of 18th century New York, stretching over half a mile in length.
Each of the 5 points is a finger. When I close my hand, it becomes a fist.
The colossal structure was erected not far from Rome. George Lucas once came to have a look at the set. Astonished at what he saw, the special effects master took his friend aside and asked him whether he knew that these types of things were being done on computers for a couple of years now. Martin grinned, and Lucas declared the set to be the last of its kind in the history of cinema.
Yes, I did. My dear, I did.
Later on, when no one in Italy was able to find an elephant for filming, George helped record and subsequently add a 3D model of the animal to a scene, the only use of CG graphics in the film. But back to the development stage. By his own admission, Harvey Weinstein had endured cinematic torture because the director had him sit through more than 80 films to determine the project's visual style.
80, can you imagine? And remember, no videos, no DVDs. Every movie has to be on the big screen. It was like going to school with Professor Scorsese.
Michael Ballhaus took over the visuals. The cinematographer had come back to Martin after 8 years. Whereas previously Michael had portrayed a sophisticated Victorian-style New York in The Age of Innocence, now it was time to show its other side.
5 points. Murderer's Alley. Brickbat Mansion. The Gates of Hell.
Casting followed the usual procedure. Martin would listen to the advice of friends and invite old acquaintances to join the production. 7 years earlier, De Niro had acted in a drama called This Boy's Life with a young Leo DiCaprio.
There ain't no cure for the summertime.
While on the set of Casino, Robert said that he hadn't seen such talent since Jodie Foster in Taxi Driver. A couple of years later, the world was struck by a wave of Leo mania, but the actor didn't let it go to his head. He fought hard for serious roles that would help him avoid being typecast as a young heartthrob. After Titanic, Leonardo's agent met with Scorsese on the set of Bringing Out the Dead and offered his client's services. Martin put the puzzle together. Liam Neeson was next to join the production and was offered the role of Walter McGinn. However, despite the film's tight schedule, the actor wanted to play Priest Fallon on screen.
That the hand that tries to strike us from this land shall be swiftly cut down.
Martin approved the swap and invited Brendan Gleeson to play McGinn instead.
Could I say what I want? That's why I wanted you.
As for John C. Reilly, he wasn't interested in the project at all.
You guys will settle with me before settling with each other.
John was talked into it by his friend Paul Thomas Anderson, a long-time Scorsese fan who had even copied a scene from Goodfellas for his film Boogie Nights.
Gigi, listen, Jack and Amber's table, take them over all the clams. Let's go. Vamos. Okay, how's it going here?
There were some difficulties with Cameron Diaz. The actress had signed a 6-week contract, but ended up stuck filming for over 6 months.
Well, gentlemen, I leave you in the grace and favor of the Lord.
Finding Bill the Butcher was a much more difficult task. The director had his eye on Daniel Day-Lewis for the role, but after the drama The Boxer in 1997, the actor not only announced his retirement, but also disappeared for 6 months in Italy, where he worked as a shoemaker. The offer was extended nevertheless. Daniel was intrigued by the idea of a mirror image of the Age of Innocence, in which moral violence would be replaced with physical violence, but the actor only agreed after meeting with DiCaprio and his friend, Tobey Maguire.
You know, when somebody has a talent like yours, it's almost their responsibility to do it, to get back in the saddle.
Challenge accepted.
The actor listened to the future Spider-Man and, as usual, went off to develop his character. Daniel worked as a butcher for 3 months.
I love to work with pigs. The nearest thing in nature to the flesh of a man is the flesh of a pig.
Studied the New York accent of the late 19th century.
You see this knife? I'm gonna teach you to speak English with this fucking knife!
And handpicked his own wardrobe. He stayed in character while on set, in between takes and even after hours, never removing his costume. Not to mention, he wore a prosthetic glass eye, which, after much practice, he learned to tap with the tip of a knife without blinking. In Scorsese's opinion, Daniel didn't just play Bill the Butcher, he became him.
I don't never sleep too much. I have to sleep with one eye open. I only got one eye, right?
Rude, filthy, and always disgruntled, he would go to the gym every morning where he would listen to songs by Eminem at full volume.
Whatever you say I am, if I wasn't, then why would I say I am?
The song, The Way I Am, personified his image. Bravado, self-importance, and boastfulness were integral characteristics of the Butcher.
Is that understood?
Lewis's obsession rubbed off on DiCaprio too. Both actors followed the method approach, so their feud extended beyond the frame.
Ain't you never been to the theater before?
Nah.
DiCaprio once accidentally broke Day-Lewis's nose, but Day-Lewis played out the rest of the scene. And on the day of shooting the final scene, both actors, without breaking character, fought each other. Their dedication was laudable, but unfortunately, Scorsese and Ballhaus were busy going over the previous take and had announced a break, so nobody caught the brawl on camera. The production experienced plenty of difficulties, but financing was certainly the most problematic. Filming took place from December 2000 to April 2001, but the money ran out halfway through the process. Scorsese and DiCaprio first lowered their own fees to the minimum allowable level, but that barely covered enough to get them through a couple of weeks. They had to ask Weinstein for help. Harvey hadn't liked the idea from the very beginning. It annoyed him that 2 Hollywood sex symbols were hidden behind mud, makeup, and greasy hair. By the way, Day-Lewis hated his hairstyle so much that he immediately shaved his head the day after the final shot.
Yeah.
As soon as the budget had been exceeded, Harvey suddenly had more influence on production and demanded that the most violent scenes be cut, especially the rat fights and severed ears. Scorsese defended the ears, but the rat fights had to be taken out. The cherry on top was shooting the ending. In the middle of the day, the producer called it a wrap and nearly forced the team to pack up. The desire to save some money led to the team having to come back 2 months later to finally get the shots they needed.
Soldiers now on 38th Street. The mob will not disperse. What are your orders?
Weinstein himself, of course, remembers it all differently. All the things I asked Marty not to do, he did. And you know what? I'm totally fine with all of it. Make no mistake, this is Marty's movie, top to bottom, completely uncompromising. And I didn't ask for a compromise. We went over a few dollars, and so what? I made this movie for Marty. I served him. That's what I did as producer on this film. For Marty, hopefully, it will be vindication at the end of a long, hard 27-year road.
I know your works.
Harvey certainly had his own special way of serving. Even before the film was released, he decided to shield himself from any financial failure and sold the international distribution rights for $65 million. That's a serious advance for such a scrupulous historical drama, especially considering that the director valued authenticity over action.
For me, the book, Gangs of New York, led to other books. His Herbert Asbury source books of the period. I just wanted to say everything.
Most of the characters in Gangs have real-life counterparts. The dead rabbits weren't just rabbits. This slang term used by Irish gangs in New York refers to the Gaelic word railbade. Translated, it means a person to be feared.
What's the battle? Natives against the dead rabbits. Which are you? What do you think? Dead rabbits.
Bill the Butcher was the moniker for a man named William Poole. There were also real people called Hellcat Maggie, William Tweed, and P.T. Barnum. Professors from the University of Washington have agreed that the depiction of the Five Points neighborhood matches that of every available historical record.
More or less everything, it's very close
to what it was, yeah.
So filming had finally finished, and that entire summer was spent editing and arguing with Weinstein. The producer nevertheless convinced the director to shorten the runtime by an hour, bringing the film to 167 minutes, which still isn't very short. The premiere was planned for the fall, but September changed the plans of every American that year. The film's release, of course, was moved. Martin took part in a charity concert in New York. It had taken Paul McCartney just 1 month to organize the event, which brought the biggest celebrities in music, movies, and television together on one stage. Leonardo DiCaprio and Robert De Niro presented Scorsese's short film, The Neighborhood.
There's probably no one who knows the ins and outs of New York better than my friend Marty Scorsese.
Change over acceptance of what America's supposed to be. Letting in the immigrants, letting in other cultures, other religions, other races, and everybody living together in freedom.
The release of Gangs of New York was first moved to Christmas 2001, but then pushed back another year. The official press release said that it was too soon for such a violent movie about the city. Martin took advantage of the delay. He finished shooting everything that he originally didn't have time for, and then re-edited the film twice. The biggest change was the complete replacement of the film's score. The work of Elmer Bernstein, who had 14 Oscar nominations and 200 films under his belt, was no longer a fit for the new version. But the final shot featuring the Twin Towers was not redone. We did the paintings and edited the skyline sequence before September, and afterwards it was suggested that we should take out the towers, but I felt, well, it's not my job to revise the New York skyline. The people in the film were part of the creation of that skyline, not the destruction of it. And if the skyline collapses, ultimately they will build another one. Finally, the release, distribution, and an acceptable result. Gangs of New York fell just short of $200 million in ticket sales. The movie's performance at the Academy Awards ceremony was record-breaking in Scorsese's career. The film received 10 nominations, including Best Director, for which Scorsese hadn't contended in 10 years. John C. Reilly also had a notable performance. The actor had starred in 4 films in the preceding year, and each nominated him for Best Supporting Actor, although he wasn't selected.
Boy, I'm down at the garage working my butt off 14 hours a day, and she's up here munching on bonbons and tramping around like some goddamn...
Competing against films like the musical Chicago, the dramas The Pianist and The Hours, as well as the fantasy The Lord of the Rings, Gangs of New York was in for a crushing defeat. It didn't bring home a single trophy, the third time that's ever happened in the history of the Oscars. Other films to suffer the same fate were The Turning Point and The Color Purple. But there was no time to sulk. In the 62nd year of his life, Martin picked up the pace to unprecedented levels. In 2003, he produced and directed an episode of the documentary series The Blues, where eminent directors explored the development of the greatest American music genre.
These rhythms were carefully preserved and passed down generation after generation, through slavery, through Jim Crow, right up till the present.
He simultaneously helped the History Channel direct the charity film Lady by the Sea, The Statue of Liberty. In the aftermath of the September attacks, New York's greatest monument had been closed to visitors, and the film raised funds to reopen Liberty, enlightening the world. But of course, his main project was a biopic about Howard Hughes. Bringing the biography of this eccentric millionaire's life to the screen had been a director's dream for the last 40 years. In the late 90s, Michael Mann decided to take up the project and chose Leonardo DiCaprio for the leading role. But after completing 2 biographies in a row, namely The Insider and Ali, the director lost his desire to do another. In 2002, 2 directors immediately jumped on the opportunity. The first was Christopher Nolan, who had just finished filming Insomnia and was planning to shoot a story about Howard starring Jim Carrey. They were already 6 months into production when Nolan found out that a similar project had already been approved by Miramax with Martin Scorsese at the helm. The director had to abandon the idea and begin working on Batman.
Nice.
That's right, Scorsese got the script from Mann, and DiCaprio was immediately interested.
He explained to me when I gave him the script that he knew nothing about aviation. But he also said, I did Raging Bull and I knew nothing about boxing.
Author John Logan had already conquered the world with Gladiator and adapted the less popular Time Machine. But The Aviator was of an entirely different nature. It was a deep story about an eccentric figure in the golden age of Hollywood. Martin was intrigued by the topic, the script, and of course the chance to work with his favorite young talent.
Well, we'll make it. Take care of that, would you?
Leonardo had been dreaming of the role for 5 years at that point, even going so far as to attach his own recently opened studio, Appian Way Productions, to the film. The plot was based on the book, Howard Hughes' The Untold Story, but underwent some significant changes. Logan wrote 18 versions of the script. The budget was again provided by Weinstein, $110 million.
We don't care about money here, Mr. Hughes.
Well, that's because you have it.
Sure, previous collaboration with the producer hadn't exactly been smooth sailing, but Harvey was the only one who had agreed to finance the expensive film, which carried no guarantee of success at the box office.
Welcome to Hollywood.
Yeah.
His only condition was that the project's timeline could not be exceeded. Scorsese signed the contract, but ultimately didn't keep to his word and personally paid out $500,000 for the violation.
Where did all that money go? Well, it went into the plane, Senator.
The director was especially interested in the story's visual aspect, so selecting the right cinematographer was critical. The first candidate was Janusz Kaminski, Steven Spielberg's permanent companion. But Kaminski was already preparing to work on The Terminal, so Scorsese turned to his old acquaintance Robert Richardson, with whom he had filmed Casino and Bringing Out the Dead.
What are your colors? Stop fishing.
Together they came up with a unique video sequence. Each year in the film corresponded to the coloring possibilities of films in those times. The film's first scenes mimic Cinecolor, an early technology of color cinematography. Then came two-tone Technicolor. Its distortion can be seen in the shots of the golf course and on the table, where there appear to be light blue and purple peas. Moving on to auditions, Martin recognized that the famous actresses who constantly surrounded Hughes were key characters.
Would you do me a favor? Would you just smile for me one time, just once?
Gwyneth Paltrow had agreed to play Ava Gardner, but for unknown reasons, she dropped out of the project and was replaced by Kate Beckinsale, who had to gain 20 pounds for the role.
You listen to my phone calls.
No, honey. I would never do that. I'd never do that. I just read the transcripts, that's all.
Gwen Stefani's big screen debut came by complete accident. Scorsese happened to see the actress on the cover of Vogue magazine on the wall of a bus stop. Gwen was posed as Marilyn Monroe. Martin immediately saw his casting match for Jean Harlow and invited her to join the ensemble without even auditioning.
You could imagine how excited I was. I mean, obviously an idol of mine, you know, she was the original blonde bombshell.
Thank you. I would like to use this occasion to publicly thank Mr. Hughes for the opportunity he gave me. Thank you.
However, casting Kate Blanchett as Katharine Hepburn was always Martin's first and only choice.
Good evening, Mr. Hughes. Madame.
It's Miss.
Miss.
Although the actress initially turned down the role due to her parts in the final installment of The Lord of the Rings and The Life Aquatic by Wes Anderson, Martin was planning to replace Kate with Nicole Kidman. But in October of 2003, wildfires hit California and burnt down part of the Aviator set. Filming was postponed and Blanchett was able to join the cast.
Now, Mr. Hughes?
If it would be convenient, Miss Hepburn.
Scorsese made Kate watch Hepburn's first 15 films, play tennis, golf, and take ice-cold baths, which Katharine had made fashionable at the time.
That's the trouble.
The scope of The Aviator was astounding. Over $2 million was spent on costumes alone, and Scorsese's longtime collaborator, Dante Ferretti, rebuilt all the sets that had burnt down.
I dreamed always this period in Hollywood, the most glamour moment in Hollywood in the 30s.
Build a stairway to paradise with a new step every day.
The producers were granted access to Hughes' real-life mansion, and the new Dial Special Effects studio designed miniature models of most of the planes used in the film.
The Hercules, a plane, a boat, a flying city.
Small-scale buildings were also made for the scene where the XF-11 crashes into some houses. Of course, DiCaprio did a deep dive to prepare for his role. He took piloting classes and met with the star of The Outlaw, Jane Russell. Hughes had been the director of that Western film, and the actress was one of the last people to remember the man when he was alive. Leonardo also studied patients with obsessive-compulsive disorder, from which Howard also suffered.
One of the scenes that we worked on was where Howard Hughes, he had to get blueprints from this other gentleman.
Show me all the blueprints. 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 Show me all the blueprints.
From what I understand in my research, it has to do with phonetics and the way you say that, to have that sentence come out of your mouth the right and perfect way.
The attention to detail, visual aesthetics, and breathtaking performances by actors earned The Aviator worldwide critical acclaim.
Good. Great.
But once again, it underperformed at the box office. The $200 million it raked in was hardly enough to pay off the film, despite its success at award ceremonies. It received 3 Golden Globes, including Best Actor and Best Motion Picture, not to mention 11 Oscar nominations. Thankfully, the mistakes of the past were not to be repeated. But the top prize went to $1 Million Baby by Clint Eastwood, who received more nominations than Martin for Best Director. A 5th defeat for Scorsese. But The Aviator grabbed 5 trophies that night. The Academy gave due praise to the visual aspects of the film.
I was tempted by your eyes. I was tempted. The promises. Garden.
Robert Richardson won the award for Best Cinematography, while Dante Ferretti and Sandy Powell each won for Best Art Direction and Best Costume Design, respectively. After 25 years, Thelma Schoonmaker also got to celebrate victory once again.
As much yours as it is mine, Marty. Not only because you helped me edit the movie, but because you think like an editor when you shoot.
And Cate Blanchett received the first Oscar of her career.
And on behalf of everyone I know in the Aviator, thank you to Martin Scorsese. I hope my son will marry your daughter. Thank you.
That same year, Scorsese told the story of another genius.
I am a man of constant sorrow. I've seen truth.
The documentary, No Direction Home, Bob Dylan, peers into a 5-year period of the musician's life, from the time he moved to New York to a motorcycle accident that caused the artist to go on an 8-year hiatus.
I don't want to go nowhere no more. You end up crashing in a private airplane in the mountains of Tennessee.
And even though the film went unnoticed, it revealed a truthful and heartfelt biography of Dylan's life.
The $100 plates, goodness hides behind its gates, but even the President of the United States sometimes must have to stand naked.
But the time had come to return to the genre, of which Martin is rightfully considered the king.
You know, FBI, the gangsters, it all goes together. It's mind-boggling.
Working on a remake of the crime thriller Internal Affairs began while The Aviator was still in the final stages of being edited. In 2003, production company Plan B Entertainment bought the rights to remake the Asian box office hit from Hong Kong for $1.5 million. Company owner Brad Pitt had originally planned to star in the film with Tom Cruise, but Tom declined because of delays, and William Monahan's script got Scorsese's attention. The Departed reminded him of his favorite film with a similar plot, the film noir drama White Heat.
Cellmates stick with him until you find out where he unloaded $300,000 in federal currency without a single bill showing up.
He was also intrigued by the challenge of making a film set in the present day, a rare experience in his career. It was only after he had agreed to participate that Martin found out it was a remake. This was upsetting for him. He decided not to watch the original film until after he'd filmed his own, primarily to minimize stylistic similarities. The director invited DiCaprio to join the project right away. By that time, Brad Pitt had already agreed to star in Babel, but he stayed on the project as producer. Pitt also believed that Leonardo was bringing some much-needed youth to a story for which he considered himself a bit too old.
You serious?
Warner Brothers allocated $40 million to the production and demanded that filming begin immediately. Casting suddenly became a race against time. The setting was moved to Boston, and so selecting a talented actor who had grown up on her streets became an obvious choice.
Really?
Matt Damon was given a chance to audition, where he proved that he would fill an irreplaceable role in the film.
Yeah, really.
But then the director faced nothing but challenges. The role of Dignam was rejected by Ray Liotta, so Scorsese turned to his second choice, Mark Wahlberg. But the actor declined the offer for about a month, possibly in an effort to avoid working with DiCaprio after The Basketball Diaries.
Yeah, we're friends, right, Mark?
Friends till the end.
Do you accept me as your friend?
Sure.
I'm gonna fucking kill you, huh? I'm gonna fucking kill you! That was a joke!
But in the end, the director's experience and charisma prevailed. Mark based his character on the police who had arrested him in his youth more than 20 times, as well as on his parents' subsequent reactions.
I know what you are, okay? I know what you are and I know what you're not. I'm the best friend you have on the face of this earth, and I'm gonna help you understand something, you punk. You're no fucking cop.
Frank Costello is the anti-hero and central character of the film. Martin had initially invited De Niro to play the role, but Robert was in the middle of shooting his own film, The Good Shepherd. Al Pacino also declined.
Yet again.
Option 3 seemed like a total long shot. Jack Nicholson, who very rarely appeared in films, rejected the offer outright, but Scorsese didn't give up. With DiCaprio and the screenwriter William Monahan in tow, he went to meet with the actor personally in hopes of persuading him. They must have left the right impression because Nicholson agreed, albeit on his own terms. Filming comedies was exhausting, and Jack longed to embody pure evil on screen. Monahan was tasked with rewriting and expanding the role. The screenwriter found inspiration in the real leader of the Boston mob, Whitey Bulger.
As the #2 most wanted on the FBI's list, second only to Osama bin Laden, speaks for itself.
Former undercover detective Tom Duffy, who spent more than 30 years with the Boston police, assisted in recreating the crime boss's image and provided advice regarding authenticity on the set. The final touch that convinced Jack to star in the film was total freedom to improvise.
I can't wait to wipe that fucking smirk right off of your face. Would you rather wipe my ass for me?
Scorsese agreed to support the actor no matter how crazy the stunt, because it would only highlight the character's unpredictability.
I'm an artist. You give me a fucking tuber, I'll get you something out of it.
3 of the best examples of Nicholson's insanity, throwing cocaine at prostitutes.
Want some coke? There it is.
The strap-on in the porn theater. And using a real pistol in the scene with DiCaprio, which Leonardo later said was one of the most memorable moments of his life.
Got something you wanna ask me?
Auditions had all but dried up, but it wasn't over. Mel Gibson turned down the role of Ellaby. If Alec Baldwin, who had impressed the director on the set of The Aviator, had not come to the rescue, Martin would not have met his deadline.
I know that.
The last additions to the cast were Vera Farmiga and Martin Sheen, who agreed without even reading the script because he'd been dreaming of working with Scorsese for 30 years.
You know what we do here?
Despite the challenges along the way, a solid cast had been assembled, but top-notch actors require decent pay, and this had an effect on the project's budget, which had now grown to $90 million. Half of that went toward the actors' fees.
I'm sorry. It was necessary.
The Departed was the last collaboration between Scorsese and Michael Ballhaus. The film was the cinematographer's swan song, bringing an end to his career in Hollywood. By the way, the director also cared about Michael's opinion. Considering that Ballhaus had filmed both Damon and Nicholson over the previous decade, perhaps it was on his recommendation that Martin had invited these actors to join the film.
Why would you have to remind me of that? Would I be any good at what I do?
Filming lasted from April to August of 2005. The incredibly steep taxes on filmmaking in Massachusetts meant that the team had just a couple of weeks to get the material they needed in Boston. The most crucial scene was filmed in the subway. It took DiCaprio and Sheen 50 trips and 2 days of shooting for a 1-minute sequence in the final cut.
Hey, where are you? Look down the car. Got me? Yeah.
A hallmark of the film is its memorable places and details. The X's that mark characters for death. The Rolling Stones song Gimme Shelter, which had previously featured in Goodfellas and Casino. And some even subtler hints. Costello and Sullivan struck up their friendship in a convenience store, and Billy's fight in that same store led to him meeting Frank.
Is there something?
The contents of the groceries in the first and final scenes are almost identical. This may be the most intricate detail of the movie. It was Frank who had filled the bag, and working for him is what led to this particular incident. And here's a noteworthy line for you.
You got any suits at home, or you like coming to work dressed like you're going to invade Poland?
Because the Nazis designed their uniforms based on the design and patterns of the Massachusetts State Police. As was the case in Gangs of New York, the animals were computer-generated, and although making a fake rat look real was a much easier task, its appearance was much more significant to the plot. Filming wore Martin out. At each stage of production, the impending finale of the film was morally exhausting. Try as one might, a director can't help but feel close to their characters and experience sincere feeling towards them.
What, do you get your period?
Scorsese did admit that the film was good, especially since he considered The Departed to be his first film with a real plot, but it drained him of his vitality.
You a psychiatrist?
I mean, I like the picture, but the process of making it, particularly in the post-production, was highly unpleasant. I said, I don't care how much I'm being paid. It'll kill me. I'll die, very simply.
Jesus Christ.
The film premiered September the 26th, 2006. Opening weekend showed that the production team's sacrifice had not been in vain. Audiences appreciated the film, and it grossed $300 million at the box office. 4 months later, Martin won the Golden Globe for Best Director, and the Academy presented the film with nominations in 5 categories. Leonardo DiCaprio was not nominated for Best Actor, only because Warner Brothers didn't want to distinguish him from the other cast members. Instead, the studio promoted Leo's candidacy for Blood Diamond.
Leonardo DiCaprio is here. Hi, Leo. How you doing? I don't have a joke. I just thought the ladies wanted to look at him for a second, so...
And to increase his colleagues' chances of winning for The Departed, Leonardo turned down the nomination for Best Male Actor in a Supporting Role. As a result, Mark Wahlberg was selected from among the group of actors, but ultimately lost to Alan Arkin. This was the only nomination that The Departed didn't win at the Oscars. Thelma Schoonmaker emerged victorious for a 3rd time, and William Monahan took home the trophy for Best Adapted Screenplay. And of course, the main awards for the evening. For the first time in his career, at 64 years of age, Martin Scorsese's film won the Academy Award for Best Picture.
And the Oscar goes to The Departed.
And he himself finally won Best Director after 6 attempts.
And the Oscar goes to Martin Scorsese.
Thank you. Could you double check the envelope?
This was the first remake in history to receive the top prize. It was the triumph that Scorsese had been longing for 25 years. Ironically, winning awards for The Departed never even occurred to Scorsese, because he thought that such a dirty, crude, and violent movie would scare the Academy away. It's a good reminder that you only get what you want when you stop asking for it.
Maybe. Maybe not. Maybe fuck yourself.
It seemed like things would finally settle down, but that same year, Martin released 2 more films. The first was an amazing short mockumentary called The Key to Reserva.
There's a page missing. We don't know what happened in between. Yes, these are pages from... and here's the best part. These are pages from a Hitchcock film.
The plot describes how Martin finds an unproduced screenplay by Alfred Hitchcock, which he then decides to film. It's sort of an ode to Hitchcock's work and that of composer Bernard Herrmann. The second project was a documentary-style portrayal of a Rolling Stones concert whose music had accompanied his career over the past 20 years.
Okay, first song.
Mick Jagger and the rest of the band put on an outstanding show at the Beacon Theatre, which Scorsese and Robert Richardson then turned into a captivating film. Shine a Light was released in 2008 and earned $15 million at the box office. Meanwhile, a pair of recent collaborators on The Departed had started a war. A bidding war, that is. Producers Brad Pitt and leading man Leo DiCaprio both wanted to buy the film rights to the memoirs of Jordan Belfort. The Wolf of Wall Street ultimately went to Leonardo, who had forked out $1 million for it and immediately sent it to Martin. The director was intrigued by the project, and the duo went around offering it to every Hollywood studio. But the story, full of drugs, sex, and obscenities, not to mention a very dubious protagonist, failed to attract an investment.
I think it's awful.
The search for a buyer dragged on, and when Scorsese was sent a script based on another novel, the time had come to make a decision. The story was fascinating, and Martin immediately sent it to DiCaprio. The The actor happened to be familiar with the author's work and had seen the film adaptations of Mystic River and Gone Baby Gone. The right to Dennis Lehan's Shutter Island belonged to Phoenix Pictures, a tiny film studio that did have a couple of hits to its name: David Fincher's Zodiac and Terrence Malick's The Thin Red Line. The company's producers were looking for well-known directors and serious stories. The prospect of having a noir thriller by the likes of this dynamic duo gave the project an almost automatic green light.
Crazy people, they're the perfect subjects. They talk, nobody listens.
Plus, in the coming months, Max von Sydow, Ben Kingsley, Michelle Williams, and Emily Mortimer would join the cast.
Who are these men?
But there was a toss-up for the role of Teddy Daniels' partner between Robert Downey Jr. and Josh Brolin. But the director's mind was changed by a letter from a fan who admired Martin's genius and offered his services whenever he could and at any price.
Can't wait.
This fan was Mark Ruffalo, and although his methods were unconventional, they landed him the role of Chuck All.
All they had to do was fake an escape to get you here, and now they have you. Now they have us both. Here, now!
As usual, before heading out to the shooting locations, Scorsese conducted a 2-week rehearsal, where he encouraged improvisation and rewrote the script. This is where the last line of the film was born. The novel's original ending had come a minute earlier.
Which would be worse? To live as a monster, or to die as a good man?
Shutter Island is one of the few films in cinematic history that was created with the intention that it be watched more than once.
I've tried to put little things in that on first viewing you might think is strange, but it doesn't raise a red flag, you know?
Sorry, Doctor. You don't happen to have an aspirin, do you?
Prime the headaches, Marshal.
The main characters, supporting characters, and even the guards played 2 different roles.
Marshal Daniels.
Doctor.
Marshal Hall. Thank you, Deputy Warden. That'll be all.
Every scene and every line can be interpreted 2 different ways.
The old school believes in surgical intervention, psychosurgery, procedures like the transorbital lobotomy.
Especially the minute details of the opening sequence. Nervous security personnel and unusual holster problems for a federal marshal. Ruffalo's character was the most distinct example of this kind of dualism.
Why was that a big deal?
At first, he plays a strange but devoted partner.
Everything about this place stinks of government ops. What if they wanted you here?
Bullshit.
Only to take on the guise of a caring physician later on.
What's wrong with you?
No wonder the title for the film Shutter Island is an anagram for 2 phrases at once: truths, denials, and truths and lies. The effect that water and fire have on the main character is also surprising. Until the end of the film, it's not clear why being near water makes Teddy feel sick.
It's a lot of water. Water.
And Andrew doesn't trust fire.
What the hell, boss? I'm your partner, for Christ's sake. We just met, Chuck.
And of course, the seeming errors of continuity cause the audience to question whether they themselves are losing their minds.
Thank you, Marshal.
The scenery itself was designed to reflect the protagonist's inner world, confused and illogical.
When you go inside, it's like you're inside your brain.
Dante Ferretti did a tremendous job. The mental hospital is based on the recollections of the project's technical consultant, Dr. James Gilligan, who had worked in institutions for the mentally ill for 30 years.
So I was asked to talk to the set designer and describe to him what the old Bridgewater had been like in the 1950s.
The red brick building on your right is Ward A, the male ward. Ward B, the female ward, is the one on your left. Ward C is that building on the bluffs.
Of course, such a location doesn't actually exist, so Shutter Island had to be pieced together from 3 separate places: Pedoc's Island, the city of Nahant, and the Medfield Psychiatric Hospital. Scenes featuring rocky cliffs were created using CGI. With the exception of digital cameras, for the first time in the director's career, the film used the latest cinematic technology. The musical component of the film was a serious experiment by Martin. There was no original score with a composer. Instead, Scorsese brought in his friend Robbie Robertson, who also happened to be one of the best guitarists on the planet. Robbie handpicked and compiled a selection of unique pieces by contemporary classical composers to transform what was happening on screen. A month before the October premiere, Paramount Pictures, who had sold the distribution rights, postponed the film's release to mid-February of the following year. This reduced the thriller's competition to a minimum, allowing it to bring in $40 million on its opening weekend and almost $300 million over the next 2 months. The highest earnings in the director's career, but everything comes at a cost, even money.
You're kidding me.
Due to the film's debut being pushed back, it became ineligible to compete for awards. The Golden Globes had already passed, and the candidates for the Oscars had to be submitted much more in advance. Of course, the film could have been eligible for the following year's ceremonies, but doing so would have been an extremely rare exception for a studio.
I've been hearing this fantasy for 2 years now. I know every detail.
At least, the director could add this project's financial success to his list of achievements. I didn't realize there are generations who do not know about the origins of film. At the beginning of the decade, Scorsese took a serious interest in a documentary film.
I remember going to the Low East Commodore. It's now gone, like most of the old theaters are.
A Letter to Elia is the biography of Elia Kazan, Martin's favorite director.
It spoke to me in a way that no one else I knew in my life seemed to be able to do.
Fun fact, Kazan's final film, The Last Tycoon, starring Robert De Niro, was released the same year as Taxi Driver.
My life has taken another turn again.
Despite his brilliant films, Elia was considered a controversial figure among creative circles. In 1952, at a meeting of the House Committee on Un-American Activities, he identified 8 actors as being members of the Communist Party, of which he himself was a member in the 1930s. The names he provided were blacklisted in Hollywood and destroyed the careers of those individuals. Half a century later, Elia received an honorary Academy Award, but some of those in attendance refused to applaud. Nick Nolte, Ed Harris, while others chose not to stand. But Scorsese's narrative focuses on the director's work, which is filled with masterpieces of world cinema.
A film director has to get a shot no matter what he does. We're desperate people. And one way or another, no matter what we have to do, we'll do it.
That same year, Scorsese got scooped up by the HBO channel for a work in television. He first shot a biopic of the writer Fran Lebowitz, famous for her poignant, caustic commentary on public life.
Here's the problem with being ahead of your time. By the time everyone gets around to it, you're bored.
Martin and Fran quickly became friends. Both grew up in New York and reveled in the magic of that great city.
Walking in New York is a mode of transport. That's how I get around. I walk everywhere.
Well, Leibowitz's story once again confirmed the director's reputation as an encyclopedia of cinematic knowledge.
You know in the third scene in that Buster Keaton movie where he's looking in the candy store, and I would say, no, I don't know that. And then he would show you the movie.
But HBO wasn't going to let Scorsese go. His next project turned out to be much more difficult. Following the completion of The Sopranos, the show's executive producer, Terence Winter, was looking for an idea for a new show. The book, Boardwalk Empire, and the rights to it was presented to him by Mark Wahlberg. The actor told him that if the project interested him, Scorsese had agreed to become a producer. The director was very interested. Winter wrote the screenplay, and Martin agreed to help cast, produce Rothstein, the gangster after whom the main character of Casino was named. Project's scope was unprecedented in the TV world. HBO spent $5 million building the set for Atlantic City's main strip. Martin didn't stop at directing the first episode. He continued to make edits to the scripts and rough cuts of most of the episodes. The Boardwalk Empire began, Scorsese was approached by the widow of George Harrison, lead guitarist of the Beatles. After watching Martin's documentary about Bob Dylan, Olivia realized that he was the only director she could trust to film a biography about her late husband. Moreover, Martin had actually met George 30 years earlier on the set of The Last Waltz. To turn down the opportunity to shoot a biography of such a great musician would have been a serious mistake, especially since Olivia Harrison was granting access to George's private collection, which contained memorabilia, letters, unreleased videos, and home movies. The film tells Harrison's life story as he pursued spirituality, amateur race car driving, philanthropy, and the meaning as one of the 4 people who had changed the world forever. Martin had honored the musical world with a magnificent film, but the time had come to show his true feelings towards his first love. Cinema. Interestingly, the director was prompted to do this by his youngest daughter. Francesca introduced her father to Brian Selznick's novel, The Invention of Hugo Cabret, and asked him to make a movie based on it, preferably in 3D. It only took a couple of minutes for Martin to be won over by the artistic retelling of the life of cinematic pioneer Georges Méliès. The main character was based on Georges, who had shot more than 500 films. The most famous of these was the first ever sci-fi film called A Trip to the Moon. But his business went under, thanks in no small part to Thomas Edison, who had closed the American movie market to Méliès. Having gone broke, the director burned most of his films and became a toy seller. It wasn't until 1932 that his contribution to cinema was finally acknowledged, when the global film community had managed to find Georges. As the founder of a charity for the recovery and restoration of rare and old films, Martin had already fallen in love with the plot. When he found out that the author of the novel was Brian Selznick, a relative of David Selznick, screenwriter of the first film that he had ever taken his mother to, he no longer had any doubts as to what project he would work on next. It didn't hurt that he had finally found funding to shoot Silence, but this new film forced him to postpone the religious drama, which after 10 years was already seeming like a pipe dream. The rights to Hugo had been purchased even before the book was published, and Scorsese's interest significantly accelerated the process. The story was adapted for the screen by John Logan, a partner in The Aviator, while Robert Richardson again took his seat behind the camera.
And so the great adventure began.
The film's new format had both the director and the cinematographer worried. The colleagues had 2 options: either shoot the film the old-fashioned way and convert it to 3D in post-production, or shoot it in compatible 3D format from the very beginning. Martin turned to James Cameron for advice, who insisted on the second option. To better understand the specifics of how this would work, Scorsese and Richardson spent 2 weeks studying modern filming technology at Cameron's production company. After a trial screening of the film, James would go on to call it a masterpiece with the best 3D cinematography in history, including his own films.
It's absolutely the best 3D photography that I've seen.
Casting, for once, turned out to be an enjoyable experience. They first found 2 talented kids.
Went into a dark room, and on a white screen saw a rocket fly into the eye of the man in the moon.
While Hugo would be Asa Butterfield's cinematic debut in a leading role, Chloe Grace Moretz had already won the hearts of moviegoers in films like 500 Days of Summer and Kick-Ass. Next to join the project were Shutter Island actors.
Magic tricks and illusion became my speciality. The world of imagination.
Ben Kingsley and Emily Mortimer, Michael Stuhlbarg.
It is a masterpiece.
Sacha Baron Cohen was called in to play the role of the inspector.
I would like to direct this movie. I think Martin is doing an awful job at it.
Scorsese admired the actor's talent and pictured him in the role immediately as he read the book.
Seems Maximilian doesn't like the cut of your jib, little man. He is disturbed by your physiognomy.
Cohen joined the cast with a dozen ideas, most of which were thrown out because the jokes were deemed inappropriate for children.
And then my false leg would fly out into the audience. But then we realized that actually the kids would be freaked out by that.
Hold the train! Whoa! Help! Help! Assistance! Hold! Hold it!
Despite the fact that the film is set in Paris, a significant portion was actually shot in London, so having the British acting elite involved in the project should come as no surprise. Francis Delatour, Richard Griffiths, and Helen McCrory are names that have never disappeared from theatre posters in England.
You were an actress.
A long time ago, children.
And then, of course, came Christopher Lee, with whom the director had maintained a cordial relationship for 20 years, but could never find a project that he felt suited the seasoned talent.
I always felt that my career would not be absolutely complete unless I did a film with Martin Scorsese.
Filming lasted 3 months, a couple of weeks of which were spent in Paris. One of the film's notable features is its layering of visual illusions, ranging from high-tech depth effects to magic, card tricks, sequences from Méliès films, cameos by Martin and Ben Kingsley's son, as well as historical cameos. The king of the gypsy guitar, Django Reinhardt, can be seen playing in the cafe scene. And among the audience, the artist Salvador Dali and writer James Joyce. The automation is the recreation of a mechanism based on inventions by Jacques Droz in 1768, which is still capable of drawing pictures no less complex than those shown in the film. Nevertheless, the lion's share of Hugo relied on computer animation. One opening camera sequence was designed before filming began, with the final rendering not being ready until a year later. But the $150 million love letter to cinema turned out to be a commercial fiasco, as the payoff for Paramount Pictures ended up being less than $200 million. Nevertheless, not only did the film receive favorable reviews from critics, Hugo virtually stole the show at the annual awards ceremony. Scorsese won the Golden Globe for Best Director, and the film received 11 Oscar nominations 2 months later, winning 5. The Academy praised the sound, set, visual effects, and cinematography, earning Robert Richardson his 3rd Oscar.
I know the rest. It's enough poetry for today.
While Scorsese was busy reveling in documentaries and telling the world about the history of film, Leonardo DiCaprio was in his 5th year of battling studios for permission to film The Wolf of Wall Street. In 2010, it almost worked out. Warner Brothers agreed to finance the film, provided it was directed by Ridley Scott. Ridley and Leo had been wanting to work together, but a critically limited budget and strict censorship forced them to abandon the project. 2 years later, the screenplay was bought by independent studio Red Granite Pictures. Producer and co-founder Riza Aziz made DiCaprio an unprecedented offer, a budget of $100 million, with a quarter of that total going towards the actor's salary, no censorship, and complete creative control. Leonardo, who saw The Wolf as a modern adaptation of Caligula, immediately signed the contract and called Scorsese. Martin had recently celebrated his 70th birthday, hardly an occasion to sign on to the most reckless film in his career.
It's gonna take this company into the fucking stratosphere!
After 40 years of battling over every frame, he had finally been given the opportunity to unleash his full power on the silver screen. But this meant that he once again had to postpone Silence, for which casting had already begun. Daniel Day-Lewis, Benicio del Toro, Liam Neeson, and Gael Garcia Bernal were in negotiations for the leading roles. This earned Scorsese the ire of Setchigori Pictures, who promptly sued him. The plaintiffs believed that the director had deliberately breached their contract for Wolf. The studio demanded $1.5 million in compensation from the director, as well as a forfeiture of claims to the project. Fortunately, the partners were able to reach a settlement, which stated that Silence would be Martin's very next feature film following Belfort's biography.
And I must trust God has put it down.
The screenplay for The Wolf of Wall Street was entrusted to the creator of Boardwalk Empire, Terence Winter. As per usual for a Scorsese film, the script was ignored while shooting.
Well, that's, Yeah, Jordan, what's EJ Entertainment?
Martin and DiCaprio took charge of casting. The actor had run into Jonah Hill at a Mexican resort and arranged for him to meet with the director. Hill preferred auditions to conversations, despite the fact that he hadn't needed an audition to land a role in 6 years. Scorsese complied with Jonah's request as a formality, because after seeing him perform in the drama Moneyball, he was already convinced of Jonah's fit for the part. However, in order to guarantee a spot in the film, Jonah cut his royalties to $60,000, the minimum amount allowed by the Actors Guild.
It's fucking good, right?
Once on set, he quickly became known as the King of Improv. Jonah not only caught everyone off guard with his remarks, but also with an artificial penis and dentures. To overcome the lisp they caused, the actor would put them in and chat with random people on the phone for hours at a time.
One thing I know about in this world is airlines. And Kushan Airlines is the future of airlines.
By the way, one of his improvs got out of control,
Who's fucking teaching you that shit?
and Josh Bernthal actually punched him so hard that his false teeth flew out, but Hill never broke character.
You okay? Hey, pal.
Although the script had plenty of crazy scenes on its own. Dwarf tossing, parading strippers, and a flight to Vegas. And yes, the goldfish survived. Animal cruelty laws allowed the actor to put the fish in his mouth for up to 3 seconds and then put it back in its tank. Jonah is also the only actor to be admitted to the hospital for a vitamin D overdose from the false cocaine. By the way, the creators were forced to change the names of several of the main characters, especially Danny Porash, who became Danny Azoff. Danny had threatened to sue the production and had every right to do so.
Smoke crack with me, bro. Smoke crack. Smoke some fucking crack with me, bro.
But back to casting. In addition to Matthew McConaughey,
I fucking love that.
Margot Robbie,
Stop flexing your muscles, Jordan. You look like a fucking imbecile.
and Jean Dujardin also joined the ensemble. 3 directors featured in the picture: Rob Reiner,
This is obscene.
John Favreau,
Stock manipulation, high-pressure sales tactics, ticky-tack shit like that.
and Spike Jonze.
I don't know anything else about them other than that.
Another industry professional helped Martin stage the scene with Steve Madden.
My name's Steve Madden.
Yeah, we know who you are.
Steven Spielberg had come to visit a friend on the set. but got so carried away by the process that at first he started giving advice to the actors and then later even helped choose angles and set up cameras.
Let's give it up for Steve Madden and his awesome Mary Lou. Hold that up, hold that up, hold that up proud.
By the way, there were real Stratton Oakmont brokers scattered throughout the crowd scenes in the office. Rodrigo Prieto, who had become famous for his work with Alejandro González Iñárritu and Oliver Stone, was brought on as head cinematographer. It was his collaboration with Stone on Wall Street, Money Never Sleeps, that got the director's attention.
I go to the one place on earth that befit my high-minded ambitions.
The most difficult scene to film was the Quaalude scene.
Pow! I mean, I had skipped the tingle phase and went straight to the drool phase.
Falling down the stairs and attempting to open the car with his feet was an improvisation by Leonardo, which he was only able to perform once due to seriously injuring his back in the process. The fight in the kitchen took 3 days to shoot. Another long day of shooting was the nursery scene.
So take a good look, Daddy.
Margot Robbie spent 17 hours seducing Leo in front of 30 members of the film crew.
Yes, I think it's true. Say hi, Mommy. Say hi to Rocco and Rocco.
In another scene, it was the actress herself who insisted on full nudity, while Scorsese recommended she use a robe. By the way, this was the first nude scene in Robbie's career, which she justified through Naomi's treatment of her body as a commodity. So this scene was, quite simply, a sale. By the way, the director considers Matthew McConaughey's cult-like improv to be the most important element of the first act, because it sets the tone for the rest of the film. A scene that was just as crazy was the interrogation sequence. Martin chose to not use the script at all, instead giving the actors one simple task: don't say anything important.
Doesn't ring a bell.
Sorry, I have no recommendation of that.
No.
Jack?
No.
Several takes lasted over 20 minutes, and according to Thelma Schoonmaker, were worthy of their own short films.
Do you recall Carter's Corporation? You do recall it?
No, I don't recall that at all.
Editing such a film turned out to be a taller order than shooting it. Sure, the studio let the director's imagination run wild, but the Motion Picture Association would not be so forgiving. Martin was forced to cut the sex scenes and either cut or revise the gay orgy. Some furniture was added to the sequence in post-production to hide the actors' genitals. However, the censors did allow 681 curse words.
Because I mean, fuckity fuck, Jordan. Look at this thing.
This achievement put The Wolf in the Guinness Book of World Records for most swearing in a motion picture. But this achievement seemed insignificant because the previous record belonged to Casino.
Break your fucking heads and you won't walk out of here. You see that fucking saw? We're gonna use it. You don't fuck around in this place.
Scorsese also used a trick from Shutter Island in post-production. Mistakes are deliberately scattered throughout the scenes where the protagonists are taking drugs. Objects change position, events are out of order, and even the cutaways themselves look incomplete and out of place.
We own the fucking company.
Wait.
The Wolf of Wall Street hit movie theaters on Christmas Eve 2013 and immediately dominated the box office. With nearly $400 million in ticket sales, it became Martin's highest-grossing film and Red Granite Pictures' first commercial success.
The real question is this: was all this legal? Absolutely fucking not.
3 years later, the company would find itself in the midst of a financial scandal. An FBI investigation led to the discovery that funds stolen from the Malaysian government had been allocated to fund production of The Wolf of Wall Street. The trial would go on to last 3 years, with Martin and Leonardo both interrogated and searched. In 2019, producer Riza Aziz would be acquitted of the charges, but his studio would close its doors.
Money doesn't just buy you a better life. better food, better cars. It also makes you a better person.
But in the winter of 2014, 5 Oscar nominations and a Golden Globe for Best Actor were no cause for concern.
I never would have guessed I would have won for Best Actor in a comedy, so I'd like to...
The following year, Martin produced more documentaries and also returned to HBO with his own work, where he proved once again that non-fiction films can be just as fascinating as anything a screenwriter can come up with.
We were, from the beginning, skeptical about state power. Matters of war, of human rights.
The 50-year argument follows the story of the New York Review of Books and the handful of radicals that started it. And of course, as was tradition, following the documentary, he decided to create a series.
Now you wanna be something, wanna be someone who can out what you're thinking about the times you did. Need to get it out.
The idea of making a behind-the-scenes biopic about the music industry was a suggestion by Mick Jagger. In the early stages, there were plans to shoot a film, and rough drafts of the script had gotten Paramount Studios' attention. But it was ultimately a friendly cable channel that approved the project. Terence Winter was again the writer and showrunner, with Martin and Mick Jagger as producers. The director also shot the pilot episode for vinyl. The project seemed to have a bright future, and the pop industry of the 70s was a fruitful topic. The episode, directed by Scorsese, captivated the channel's viewers and was immediately renewed for a second season. But at the end of the 10th episode, ratings had dropped to such low levels that the bosses at home box office closed the project.
I don't know what it is with you people.
Scorsese called it a tragic decision, but took the blame for it because he believed that he should have filmed all of the episodes.
It's too late. It's too late. They fucked us. We got fucked.
In 2015, the director also created the world's most expensive advertisement.
I'm gonna get this part.
The short film, The Audition, was, to put it bluntly, a joke, the goal of which was to show off the luxury casinos in Macau and the Philippines. The script was written by Winter, and the actors shot the film in a week without ever leaving New York. The gambling palaces hadn't been completed yet, so green screens were used to portray their luxury interiors. The actors' fees were over $10 million for each participant. The buyers limited screenings to just the casino opening and commercials in Chinese movie theaters.
I just need 20 seconds with my director, if you don't mind. Just 20 seconds? Yes, we've done 5 films together.
Oh,
my director.
I've done 8 films.
Finally, the time had come to shoot another film that had been waiting in the wings for over 20 years.
It took years to reach us.
Preparations for Silence had been ongoing for 4 years at that point. The most recent delay had caused all of the actors to leave the project, except for Liam Neeson.
I'm happy to help. It is fulfilling to finally be of use in this country.
Martin had approved Andrew Garfield for the role in 2013.
I thanked God for bringing me here.
He was joined by Adam Driver. Preparing for the roles not only cost the actors their time, but also their health. Driver lost 55 pounds, 35 before filming and another 20 during. Garfield turned down other projects for a full year as he grew out his hair and beard. Together, they participated in a 2-week silence retreat and visited dozens of monasteries around the world. Filming took place over 3 months in Taiwan. Local director Ang Lee helped with location scouting for Scorsese. Silence quickly became the worst filming experience of Martin's career. A budget of $46 million was nothing to scoff at, but when artificial sets and green screens were replaced with a natural environment and lighting, costs can skyrocket right before your eyes.
I never knew Japan when it was a country of light, but I have never known it to be as dark as it is now.
This approach squeezed the budget down to the last cent, so the film crew had to skimp on conveniences, even when it came to sleeping arrangements. Add to that the unforgiving weather combined with Martin's health and age. The kid who wasn't allowed to go on walks because of his asthma was here, 70 years later, battling against typhoons to get the shots he needed.
Your faith gives me strength, Mortgage.
Rodrigo Prieto was able to unleash his full potential as he once again took his place behind the camera. This was also the first time since Shutter Island that Martin had decided to shoot exclusively on film, resulting in stunningly beautiful shots. The only exceptions were candlelit scenes. The team didn't want to use artificial light, so these sequences were filmed with ultra-sensitive digital cameras. This was Liam Neeson's second time playing a priest for Scorsese, and recalled how the director had turned into somewhat of a tyrant on set.
Rumor, Father, only. I must conclude it is true.
Martin demanded absolute silence from every member of the film crew, from actors to administrative assistants. If someone broke the silence, filming would stop and the culprit was threatened with being fired. Everyone involved in silence had to remain silent. Upon completion of post-production, Martin held a private screening of the film in the heart of the Catholic world, the Vatican. 400 priests were invited to the premiere, whose opinion mattered more to the director than anything else. When the film ended, the clergyman had absolutely no editorial suggestions. However, the MPAA gave the film an R rating. This was the second film in Martin's career to receive such a rating without any swearing, the first being The Last Temptation of Christ.
I pray, but I'm lost. Or am I just praying to nothing?
But audiences didn't appreciate the story of the Portuguese missionaries who carried the word of God to Japan. The film only grossed $23 million at the box office. Given that the film had been financed by independent production companies without any large studios involved in distribution, this was a painful blow. Disparaging reviews from festivals and award organizations only dragged out the punishment. Silence received just one Oscar nomination for Best Cinematography, but Rodrigo Prieto lost out to Linus Sandgren and his work in La La Land. Martin and Robert De Niro had been looking for a project they could do together for several years. They had settled on screenplays a couple of times, but it wasn't until 2007 that a concrete idea had finally started to take shape. Robert had read a book called I Heard You Paint Houses by Charles Brandt and immediately sent it to Martin. The director was immediately interested because the novel looked like the perfect farewell piece to his portrayals of the criminal world, something Scorsese had been doing his entire life. It took 2 years to get a screenplay written, which Steve Zaillian had taken on. Steven had become well known for his work on Awakenings, American Gangster, and Schindler's List, the latter of which had brought them together back in the early 90s. Afterwards, Zaillian had helped complete the script for Gangs of New York, and by 2009 had finished working on the adaptation for The Irishman. Before casting had begun, Brad Gray, head of Paramount Pictures, became interested in the project. Shutter Island had been a profitable success for the studio, so providing a $100 million budget didn't seem like a problem. But after a couple of years of preparations and due to a series of unsuccessful investments, Gray lost his seat at Paramount and the new bosses abandoned the project. According to the director, no other studio in Los Angeles wanted another De Niro and Scorsese film. But in 2016, they found one. The CEO of Netflix, Ted Sarandos, offered to take on Martin's film with a budget of $160 million. It was no secret that Scorsese was openly opposed to home viewing and didn't like the philosophy of streaming services. To agree to this deal meant there wouldn't be a theatrical release, because the company's policy didn't allow films to be distributed until after a month on Netflix. Large movie theater chains received their films 90 days before they hit other services and would not do business any other way. So an agreement with Netflix meant no deal with theaters. But Scorsese convinced the company to bend their rules for him and allow a theatrical release right from the start.
What did I know?
Much later, in August of 2019, Netflix would rescind this deal, and the film was released according to the company's standard practices.
We tried everything we could.
The greatest casting challenge they faced was persuading Joe Pesci to join. Robert presented the book to Joe and told him that they simply had to make this film.
Yeah, good, okay, bye.
The actor had retired and is rumored to have turned down about 50 other offers. But how could he say no to such a reunion?
Oh, thanks. Frank. Hey, Frank. How you doing?
Joe agreed and insisted that he play the role of Tony Pro. But the director wanted to show a different side of the actor and insisted on an unusual character for Pesci, Russell Bufalino.
Do you know why God made the sky so high?
No.
So that the little birdies don't bunk their head on it when they're flying around.
Martin had called on Harvey Keitel. They hadn't worked together since The Last Temptation of Christ 30 years earlier.
You don't know how good a friend you got. I know. No, you don't know.
Harvey's involvement made the film even more epic. When Al Pacino, who for various reasons had refused to work with Scorsese throughout his career, agreed to play Jimmy Hoffa, the film acquired a new historical significance.
We are the biggest and best and most honest union in this country.
The director knew most of the supporting actors from Boardwalk Empire. 10 people from that series made it into the film.
You people? I'm done. You're done?
I'll rip your fucking head off. Hey!
As well as a couple from the recent show Vinyl.
Can they prove it?
Ironically, there wasn't a single Irishman in The Irishman.
They wouldn't dare. They wouldn't dare.
Even in the early stages of preparation, Martin was concerned with finding actors to play a young De Niro, Pesci, and Al Pacino. This option was considered, but given that the entire film is riddled with flashbacks, it didn't make much sense. Then it was CGI to the rescue.
Whatever you need me to do, I'm available.
The company, Industrial Light and Magic, developed a special motion capture and rejuvenation technology for the film. This allowed the actors to forego conspicuous makeup and prosthetics that were common in movies up to that point. To bring this effect to life, scenes were simultaneously shot on 3 cameras equipped with special lenses.
Which is the camera surrounded by 2 what we call witness cameras, which are infrared cameras.
Test takes with De Niro amazed both the producers and the director. This experimental innovation created especially for The Irishman is the main reason the budget became inflated.
Oh, I decided nothing. It felt fine. Oh, come on, Frank.
By the way, the computer-generated rejuvenation was only used on De Niro, Pesci, and Pacino. The rest of the actors still used makeup. The effect may still be noticeable, but keep in mind that these types of graphics are still in their infancy, and The Irishman will go down in history as the first film to try it.
Use the CGI as makeup.
That was the big turning.
Yeah,
that was the thing.
That's the big thing.
Yeah.
When filming began at the end of August 2017, the director was caught off guard by another problem. The 3 main actors were all over 75 years old. Their movements were slower, their postures had changed, and even their speech had become quieter.
Like some guy who's always rushing all over the place, and they missed the big picture.
The first day on set, Martin was satisfied with Al Pacino's acting, but cinematographer Rodrigo Prieto asked the director to tell Al to get off his chair more energetically. This was Scorsese's first time working with Pacino, and he didn't want to start off on the wrong foot by telling the actor that his movements were too much like that of an old man. The character of Hoffa was only 49, according to the script. Fortunately, this didn't cause any contention.
Him and all the bullshit problems he put me through. Already, I gotta go. You don't expect me to look at this.
In fact, the actors put as much energy as possible into subsequent scenes, which further highlighted the technological advances and contrast between the time jumps.
I'll apologize for being late. After I kidnap your granddaughter, rip her guts out, and send them to you in a fucking
Of course, sequences where the movements didn't match the actor's supposed age weren't avoided. The most obvious example is the scene with the shopkeeper. De Niro clearly didn't have enough energy, especially considering the person behind the character he was playing. The real Frank Sheeran was about 6'4", and although this scene isn't a good example, the stature of 5'8" De Niro was manipulated throughout the film through perspective, scenery, and camera movements to mimic the dimensions of the real Irishman.
I don't know how he did it, and I ain't gonna ask.
Filming lasted 107 days, the longest shoot of Martin's career, but considering that each take required at least 9 cameras and the film consisted of 300 scenes in 100 locations, it wasn't that long after all. As for the year it took to edit the film, this was fairly standard for the director. Thankfully, Scorsese wasn't facing pushback from producers or censors, so he got to include all his favorite shots in the final cut, including references to his own previous work.
Now, for something like this, you're gonna need 2 guns. The one you're gonna use, and a backup.
What are you doing? You're leaving your car?
He watches the car for me. It's easier than leaving it at a garage and waiting.
The film's runtime ended up being 3.5 hours, the longest film in his career, as well as the longest big-budget American feature film in the last 20 years. The last picture to require such stamina was Kenneth Branagh's Hamlet.
To be or not to be? That is the question.
Netflix turned out to be a sanctuary for Martin, just as HBO had been, because in the same year, even before the premiere of The Irishman, he shot a semi-documentary film about Bob Dylan covering the legendary Rolling Thunder Revue tour.
Everything is gonna be different.
In the film, truth and fiction are intertwined. Staged interviews are replaced with real ones, turning history into legend. The magic that Scorsese possesses is unsurpassed. The Irishman premiered on November the 27th and immediately became the most watched film on Netflix. It went on to receive nominations for 5 Golden Globes and 10 Oscars.
Marty, I gotta tell you, I love the first season of The Irishman.
Unfortunately, Martin and the crew experienced the same disappointment as they did with Gangs of New York. Not a single award.
And you let this happen in public?
But director Bong Joon-ho let Scorsese know how the global film community felt about him. The director is currently working on 3 projects: the Paramount television series The Devil in the White City, about a Chicago serial killer in the late 19th century, a biopic about 32nd US President Theodore Roosevelt, and the crime drama Killers of the Flower Moon, a history of an Indian tribe that experienced a series of killings after oil was discovered on their land in the 1920s. Leo DiCaprio is set to play the lead character in all of these productions, and in Killers of the Flower Moon, he will star alongside De Niro. Yes, Martin will be turning 80 in the next couple of years, but it looks like he will never stop confessing his love for cinema because he always manages to find new words to express it.
Every step is a first step. Every brushstroke is a test. Every scene is a lesson. Every shot is a school. So let the learning continue.